should be recording.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. As Joe said, what hopefully you are now seeing on your screens is me in a little circle and the slides large. Joe, I don't know if you also want to turn your camera off as we go through the session, so then it might not get mixed with anyone else's as the sole speaker with the video on. That then should be large in front of you. If you've got questions throughout, feel free to pop those into the chat. Thanks for those who have put in already some suggestions of what you want to get from this session, where we're thinking about also supporting others, as well as why can it be so hard to get rid of this imposter chatter, even though we've got this external evidence to the contrary that says we are good at what we do. So thank you for those. If you've got any other comments, questions that you want to put into the chat during the course of the session, I will do my best to keep an eye on those, and Joe will also have an eye open to them as well, and will interject at some point and ask them on your behalf if she thinks I've missed something. What you'll also see on the screen right now is a link to my webpage for where you will be able to find extra information on this particular topic, because although we've got an hour and then an extra 30 minutes together, it's a big topic. We can only discuss so much, and very sadly I don't have a magic wand and I can't wave it to go, hey, henceforth thou shalt be banished, that imposter thoughts will disappear. It doesn't quite work like that, but what you can do is find some extra information. So if you want to go to my website, there's a page, kateatkin.com/MPLS, where you will find some other pointers on the topic that we're talking about this afternoon. Also, if there's something that I don't get the chance to address or want to look up, I can update the web page and put an extra answer up there. So we'll see what happens during the course of the session too. And if it needs amending and updating, I will add 1 or 2 extra pointers based on what you are asking from me during the course of this session. So as well as Joe suggesting that cameras are off and that you select the speaker view so you will see my video in full screen, may I also set 2 ground rules for this session. The first ground rule is one of confidentiality. So if you get a comment from somebody in the chat that you see and you can see who's asked it, what happens there is that remains confidential to this session. What you hear from other people, you don't pass on anywhere else. But what you hear from me and what you learn as your takeaways, absolutely feel free to share. So that's the only ground rule from a confidentiality perspective. And the second ground rule that I might like to suggest is one of kindness, which we afford kindness and respect to other people, and then we tend to not give it to ourselves. So I'd like to suggest during the course of the next hour and a half, you perhaps stop shoulding on yourself and beating yourself up with your internal imposter chatter. And you maybe look at yourself with kindness and curiosity, with a, that's interesting perspective. So if you can be as kind to yourself as you would to others, then you can carry on doing that after this session, but particularly during the course of this session, because for some people it is a very personal, very deep topic. So there is an element of you looking after yourselves from that point of view. But also on the web page that I've given you, you will be able to find my contact details there too. I've given you an email address and a mobile number. If you've got something that you want to ask after this session, again, feel free to get in touch. So I'd like to set the scene by reading something, and it's called A Declaration of Self-Esteem by Virginia Satir. I am me. So if you take a deep breath in as I sound my singing bowl and settle into hearing me read this. Okay, here goes. I am me by Virginia Satir. In all the world, there is no one else exactly like me. Everything that comes out of me is authentically me, because I alone choose it. I own everything about me, my body, my feelings, my mouth, my voice, all my actions. Whether they be to others or to myself, I own my fantasies, my dreams, my hopes, my fears. I own all my triumphs and successes, all my failures and mistakes. Because I own all of me, I can become intimately acquainted with me. By so doing, I can love me and be friendly with me in all my parts. I know there are aspects about myself that puzzle me, and other aspects that I do not know. But as long as I am friendly and loving towards myself, I can courageously and hopefully look for solutions to the puzzles and for ways to find out more about me. However I look and sound, whatever I say and do, and whatever I think and feel at a given moment in time is authentically me. If later some parts of how I looked, sounded, thought and felt turn out to be unfitting, I can discard that which is unfitting and invent something new for that which I have discarded. I can see, hear, feel, think, say and do. I have the tools to survive, to be close to others, to be productive, to make sense and order out of the world of people and things outside of me. I own me, and therefore I can engineer me. I am me, and I am okay. So during the course of this session, if you find something of how you thought and felt or acted that you think now may be unfitting, you can discard that which is unfitting and invent something new for that which you have discarded. You can engineer yourselves, but in here also it says about being friendly and loving to myself. I can courageously and hopefully look for solutions to the puzzles. The imposter phenomenon, as we should call it, and I'll explain why in a moment, is a little bit puzzling. It's different for different people. It's not an easy thing to identify, and it's not something that comes with a quick fix solution. But if we are friendly and loving towards ourselves, which that ground rule of kindness is why I've suggested it, we can look for some solutions to those puzzles, some ways of identifying what's been going on, why it might have been happening, and what we can do about it. So what I'm going to cover during the course of this session as a broad overview is to give you an idea of why it's really a phenomenon. So we'll talk about what it is and why it's a phenomenon. 3 ways at least to combat the imposter feelings, and also what you can do to provide some support to others. So for those of you who popped into the chat at the start, the idea is to look at what you can do to support students, and from a mentor perspective, then my intention is that you will also get that as well as from a personal perspective. If you would like to take some notes during the course of this session, I often find when I listen to a talk, I can get some aha moments, and I'm hoping you'll get some too from this. But what sometimes happens is those aha moments disappear once the talk has finished. So if you would like to capture your notes, this is a structure that you might like to use. And it's simply, I guess I'm in the old-fashioned camp. I have a piece of paper and a pen and I divide it into 4 boxes. You might want to open up a new document on your computer or phone or whatever you choose to take notes on, and have simply some ideas of things you want to stop doing, things you want to start doing, some things you maybe just want to mull over and think about, and then give yourself some recognition perhaps of some things that you want to carry on doing too. So for those of you who've got access to the chat, you might like to give an indication, or by all means use the reactions button with the thumbs ups, which you can choose to do, and say whether or not you agree with this quote by Henry Ford. So whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. If you agree with Henry Ford, find the little thumbs up. If you disagree with him, find something else to give me a different reaction and response to it. So if you'd like to use the reactions button, I have the gallery view open in front of me and I can see whether or not you choose it, or if you want to put your reaction into the chat, again, please feel free to put your reaction into the chat. So I've got 1 thumbs down so far, 2 thumbs downs. I haven't got any thumbs ups yet that I'm scrolling through. Haha, lovely. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So somebody's been told that by their mum. I will go back to answer the question that's popped in. So think about was the other option. So I love the puzzled look as well. Thank you very much for that. So we've got some thumbs ups. We've probably got more thumbs ups than thumbs downs coming through now with those reactions. Thank you all very much. But we have definitely got some disagreement to this quote. And what I find really interesting about this is that I've worked with this quote for myself and built my own confidence up in using it to say I've got to think I can, to think I can, to think I can. And there's this the little book about the engine that could, and it's I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. It can be a really helpful message to have when you want to build your confidence. But confidence, the belief that you can do something, so the perceived ability to succeed at a given task is how it was defined by Albert Bandura back in 1977, is a different psychological construct from the imposter phenomenon. Because we can logically know that we can do something, have the experience that we're able to do something, and yet, as somebody mentioned at the start, still think it's really hard to overcome this imposter despite the external evidence that says we can do it. Why do we still have the I'm not sure I can, I don't think I can, I can't, I can't, I can't, and we go and sometimes shrink. So it was in 2013 that I rethought Henry Ford's quote, having used it. Like somebody said, their mums always had this comment going through in their mind as well. It's this, I rethought the quote by Henry Ford and went, maybe he's wrong. I'll just introduce myself a little bit and tell you why that might be the case. So I was the middle one of three girls, growing up on a farm in rural Lincolnshire with a comfort zone amongst the chickens and the geese. So I don't know if anybody else has that type of comfort zone in amongst chickens and the geese and get the goslings to nibble your ear. And I got the shy label out of the three of us. So if you've got siblings, maybe you will also recognise the fact that some of you get labels. And my older sister got the academic label. I got the shy label. My younger sister got the chatty label. The other fact as we were growing up was that my older sister and younger sister both passed the 11 plus exam, which in those days was something that the whole country seemed to take. It doesn't happen in the same way these days, but in England, in certain parts, there are some areas which still do the 11 plus exam. It's a little bit like the Harry Potter sorting hat, which says if you're academic and clever, you go off to the grammar school. If you're deemed practical, you go to the secondary modern. I went to the local secondary modern school, and in my head, I internalized the message I am not academic, I am not clever, I am definitely not university material. And I didn't go to university. I know I'm talking to folks at Oxford University, but actually, I don't have a first degree. I went off to Norwich City College and did an HND in business studies after my A levels, which apparently stands for has no degree. And then in 2013, I did something that I never thought I would do. And that was at my husband's encouragement. I started a master's in applied positive psychology at the University of East London. And quite naturally, my fellow students would ask me what my first degree was in. This felt like a big confession time because I had to say I didn't have one. And then they would exclaim surprise that you were allowed to do a master's without a first degree. Well, yes, you are allowed to do a master's without a first degree. And I got a distinction not only for my first academic essay, but also a distinction overall for my MSc. And it was during the first year of doing my master's that I went on a little bit of a rabbit warren aspect. I don't know if you, those of you who are in that studying mode, find that you get taken down some threads when you look at academic research. And, oh, this one looks interesting. And I discovered the work by Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes on the imposter phenomenon. It wasn't a taught topic at the University of East London on the MSc programme, but it was something that I found really resonated with me. And then as I read it, I went, oh, yes, 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 yes. Maybe I can do my dissertation on this. So my dissertation at the end of my MSc, I interviewed 12 entrepreneurs on the imposter phenomenon and discovered some thinking that they had about this. Also, it helped me rethink this quote by Henry Ford. Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. Because there are times when some people who think they can have got no evidence to show of that belief. No evidence whatsoever. might fall flat on their face, or they might manage to have a what's called a fluke and be able to succeed. So whether you think you can, some people have got zero evidence and can't do it. And there are some people who think they can't, but not only can they, I'm going to suggest there's folks here this afternoon, not only can you, but you already are doing it. So to rephrase this quote, it's helpful from a confidence perspective to push yourself out of your comfort zone to get going, to have a go at something, but it absolutely does not help when you're looking to overcome the imposter chatter. Because if you think you can't, I'm going to suggest that you may be wrong. And I am now in my 6th and final year of a PhD, looking at the imposter phenomenon in the workplace and understanding coping strategies and the role of psychological courage. I'm not quite sure I've changed the internal mindset of academic and clever yet, and I certainly am not looking forward to my Viva, which will be around this time next year. I've got to submit by February 2024. I feel I can do the thesis now. I've got some evidence, I've got some results, but is the Viva going to be the time that they find me out that I didn't quite do it right? So that's something that is my own perspective, and maybe some of you can also resonate with that when you had your Vivas, or if you're doing a PhD at the moment and coming up to one. But the imposter phenomenon is something that I've both felt personally and quite significantly over a number of years. And as I've come across it, I've started to recognize the anxiety that it had been causing me. And I know this is coming towards the end of the sessions for the Mental Health Awareness Week that MPLS have put on for you folks. And what the theme is for this year for the Mental Health Awareness Week is anxiety. And anxiety is one of the things that the imposter chatter causes in a lot of people. For some, it's a little bit of a light touch. For others, it can be really deep and can be quite constraining. And also from an internal, for me personally, I would experience crippling stomach aches since my teenage years. And I've been bouncing back and forth to the doctors about these stomach aches. Now I understand the imposter phenomenon. I can actually go, oh, that's what it was. Now, not everybody will experience crippling stomach aches linked to their imposter chatter, and not everybody who has crippling stomach aches will be because of imposter chatter. But it's interesting because it manifests differently for different people. But what it was defined as by Clancy Dimes, which is back in 1978, they coined the term the imposter phenomenon. So really, it's not an imposter and it's not a syndrome. So the imposter is that you feel like a fraud, not that you are deliberately defrauding people. So Frank Abagnale was immortalised in the film Catch Me If You Can. And he was the one who deliberately set out to be a fraud. What the imposter is that you feel like one on the inside, but what everybody else sees is a successful you. And it's this internal feeling of phoniness despite the external evidence of success. It's also technically not a syndrome. A syndrome has a pathological mental health connotation with a, oh my goodness, woe is me, I'm suffering from the imposter syndrome. No, in actual fact, we experience the imposter phenomenon at certain points in time. And if you struggle to say the word phenomenon, then perhaps channel the Muppets song and go phenomenon. It's that sort of the way of being able to say it. And I think syndrome has caught on with the media and hashtags, etc., on social media, is that it is simpler to say, but actually it's not something we suffer from. It's something we experience at certain points in time. And a phenomenon is an occurrence at certain points in time. And those points in time will differ for different people. So for you and somebody may be sitting next to you or that you go and meet for lunch tomorrow, they could have, oh yes, I've experienced the imposter phenomenon, but it may well be for completely different reasons. It differs from self-doubt, but is often conflated with self-doubt. So self-doubt, I would argue, is perfectly healthy and really normal and good to have when you are doing something for the first, second, or third time. It's like, I'm wondering whether or not this will work. That's a good thing to have in your brain, rather than the belief, as I said at the start, was you think you can. It's like, yep, this is going to go swimmingly, absolutely fine, when you've never done it before. So self-doubt like that is useful, but the imposter style self-doubt that isn't so useful is when you've already got your track record of success. You've already got, let's say, 13, 30 different situations under your belt that say, yes, you can do this, but you are still on the inside wondering whether or not this time it's going to work out all right, whether or not you should be the one doing it, whether or not if you make a mistake and it works, all the rest would have been flukes. The problem with this particular phenomenon as well is that for some people, it prevents them from recognizing knowledge, skills, and capabilities. So when we learn something, we tend to keep our mindset back into our past. We tend to reflect back on, for me, my 11 plus failure. It's like, oh yeah, but I didn't have a first degree. I didn't go to university. I'm no good at da 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 da. We tend to hold ourselves back rather than reflect what we've learnt now. And so it prevents people from recognizing their knowledge, their skills and capabilities and taking those in on the inside. It also stops people putting themselves forward for promotion or new tasks, trying things out, speaking up in a supervisor session, putting something into the chat in a meeting, asking a question, challenging a decision that's been made. So it holds people back from using their voice, from using their knowledge, skills and abilities, from in some ways, and say being successful, but other times it pushes people forward. And the more success you have, the more likely you are to experience the imposter chatter. Some people who are very successful will go, how did I get to be here? I didn't expect to be at this level. The other thing that I find really important to flag, particularly linked to this session as well, is that it does cause for some high levels of stress, anxiety, and there's a little bit of research that links it also to depression. So anxiety, clinical anxiety and clinical depression are separate constructs, but some of it could be triggered by imposter feelings for some people. So if you've got questions and comments on that, feel free to put anything into the chat. But also what I'd like to ask you now, if you would want to put a run of either A, B's, C's or D's into the chat, what do you think your own experience has been on this? Have you had this personally, but it hasn't held you back? That's an A, where you've just pushed through, you felt it, perhaps maybe a little bit of a light touch, but maybe if you've experienced it and it has held you back, you pop B into the chat. If you want to say something about whether or not you've not experienced it yourself, but you do know others who have, then that would be C. And then D is, of course, as it says there, none of the above. And I can see as I'm flicking through what's come through into the chat so far, I've got a smattering of A's, not very many, but I have the vast majority coming through as B's. So there's a lot of B's coming in here, which means that it's one of these things that people are experiencing frequently. There's a lot of you having these thoughts, but whether or not you've told anybody about them is a different matter. And I think we are getting better at having the conversations, but we're not quite there yet. If you were in a D perspective, and I haven't spotted any Ds, I might have missed them. I haven't spotted any Ds that have come through, but if you were a D, if you look at the number of Bs that have come through in the chat and the number of As that have come through, the chances are really you're not. You will know somebody who's experienced it, but just maybe you haven't had that open and honest conversation with them about it. So what I'd like you to take away from this is that in some ways you are in good company. It's not just you that feels this. And when I was doing my research for the PhD, I've interviewed 21 people, 5 men, the rest were women. And it was really interesting hearing people saying, this may sound weird. You know, this might sound strange. I know I'm the only one who, and I'm going, that doesn't sound weird at all. I've heard it before. Not strange to me. And we think it's weird. We think we're weird. We think it's a strange thing to experience, but in actual fact, it's very common. And there's a piece of academic research that indicates 70% of people, roughly speaking, will experience this during the course of their lives. The other 30% aren't necessarily in the flip opposite camp, which we'll talk about in just a moment, which is the Dunning-Kruger effect. The other 30%, maybe most of those, have a healthy sense of what they can do and what they can't do, and they're okay with that. When I did some research with one of my academic supervisors, Dr. Terry Simpkin, with Total Jobs, it came out that 68% of senior managers were experiencing the imposter phenomenon, and then 76% of junior managers, which is a lot higher. And I'm wondering if some of that was conflated with normal self-doubt. I don't know the answer because we didn't have the individuals to go back to, but just thinking about that, it's a common experience for people. You are not alone in experiencing this. And some of the internal conversations or desires that we have might be, and you might be thinking something different, that's okay. And if you want to share any of your thoughts into the chat, feel free to do so. But when things go well, we become afraid that we won't be able to replicate the success. So a distinction for the first academic essay, worked extra hard on the second one and only got a merit. You know, it's this point about I've got to push. I'm fearful that I won't be successful. Hey, I've got into Oxford University. Oh my goodness, that's amazing. Oh, do I really belong here? You know, should I do this? I've got to work extra hard. I don't know if I'm going to be able to replicate that. Do I deserve it? So sometimes we have this spiral in our brains. So feel free to indicate if you want to use a thumbs up reaction to see whether or not this has happened to you. But this desire for success followed by a yay! Uh-oh, now I've got to live up to that. Yeah, so I've got some people recognizing it's familiar. It's this, we want it to be successful, but then we fear whether or not we're going to be able to replicate it. Then we can sometimes find it hard to accept compliments or praise. Oh, it wasn't me, it was the team. I'm just doing my job. Oh, it was because I worked hard. Oh, it was because it was a collective assignment. So we find it hard when something has gone well to accept that praise on the inside. And one of my participants said that they would prefer to crawl under the table than take a compliment. I find that really, in some ways, if I look at it objectively, I find it really sad because people are giving compliments out to give you encouragement, to say how much they value you, to say what they recognize and what they see in you. And yet it's so hard to take on the inside. And I also recognize for myself how easy it is to dismiss the compliments. I've been there, done that, and I've got an easy way of my brain just going, ah, yes, but we'll come back to that and talk about it. Then there's the dread of being evaluated. When you submit an essay, when I submit one of my chapters to my supervisors, are they going to tell me it's a load of rubbish? When you go to a supervisor meeting, when you have a meeting with a mentor, from an employed perspective, every time you have a performance appraisal, any of these things can be this point, this evaluation touch point. So exams for students can be, obviously we know, particularly stressful, but layer that on top with the imposter chatter. Is this the time they'll realise that they shouldn't have let me into Oxford? You know, that can also be a particularly difficult thing to deal with. And what about asking questions? What about saying, I don't know? If you dare to do that, that says how much you don't know to other people. So sometimes we stay quiet or we pretend we know. And then what do? We get our phones out and we then quickly Google to see if we can find out the answer. Or we maybe WhatsApp the person that we know is in the same meeting as us to say, do you understand what they're on about? So there's sometimes that's going on as well, and it inhibits what's called in research, it's called the employee voice. It inhibits us asking questions, speaking up, talking about our ideas, sharing our thoughts. So therefore it inhibits creativity. So thinking about what you also might like to look at, and the flip side I mentioned a moment ago, is the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is where people have this high perception of their ability, but low evidence of their actual ability. The imposter phenomenon is where there's high evidence of your ability, but the perception is low. Where I think it would be healthy to go is somewhere in the middle, because as our ability grows, so could our perception of our ability. But what we tend to do is we tend to stay stuck in our heads in our own past about perceiving ourselves as how we were, rather than comparing ourselves to ourselves. We compare ourselves to other people. We look at somebody else and find that they're better than, smarter than, more intelligent, whatever it might happen to be, than us, have got better marks, can find it easier to do these particular types of equations or studies or tests, bench work, all of this. And we're comparing ourselves to others and finding ourselves lacking. But what if you compared yourself to yourself? What if you could look and go, do you know what? This time last week, this time last month, this time last year, this is how much I've learnt since then. That will be a really healthy comparison to make, to enable you to recognize that your ability has grown and therefore your perception of your ability could grow alongside it and match it. So the suggestion I have, you might want to go into either the start box or a think about box, is that you start to compare yourself to yourself. And maybe in the stop box is to stop comparing myself to others, because we can all do it easily and we can always find somebody who's better than us. But what triggers the imposter chatter? For some people, it may be some of the following. And for others, it can be something that's completely different. So and we just had a comment come through into the chat about working for Oxford doesn't actually help. And I've put this here about organisational culture. The organisation, the university culture, absolutely might well be part of it. It's like this expectation, this what you see is everybody else putting out this amazing work, fantastic things that they're doing. The alumni have gone on to do da 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 da. You don't actually say what alumni have failed at something. But if you spoke to those who have done this amazing work, you will find that they have had their failures along the way. We've had our experiments. We know actually what doesn't work. Sorry, we know what does work by finding things that don't work. That's an interesting point. So yes, sometimes for some people, it will be childhood messages and parenting styles. Sometimes it's you came home from primary school and you got 8 out of 10 in your spelling test and your parent asked you, which 2 did you get wrong? Oh, I must be perfect to be loved. And my dad is a self-confessed hypercritical parent. Nothing's ever quite good enough. You know, the what went well, even better if formats for giving feedback, really good structure. What went well, even better if. There's always an even better if coming. I would love him, even now I'm in my 50s, I would love him to give a, that was great, full stop. You know, it will be fantastic. It's not going to happen. There's always going to be some little bit of criticism from my dad coming towards me. Now, as an adult, I know that I should be able to go, well, that's his stuff, and separate it out. But there's still an internal child that just wants to have that parental approval. And maybe that's the same for you. Or maybe you received the hyper supportive parenting, as one of my clients did when I was working up in London a few years ago. And she said from a hyper supportive parental perspective, her mother told her she could do anything that she wanted to do. She'd be great at it, whatever she chose. And when she failed her driving test, she was absolutely floored by it. And I'm wondering whether or not that might be part of the kickback from the difficult SATs tests last week as well. I haven't read enough about that to be able to make the decision, but the success, and for some, being successful, getting through school, having those fantastic A levels, getting into Oxford, you know, and then suddenly, oh, I'm not at the top with everybody else. I'm in a par, I'm in an also ran. Maybe I'm not as clever as I thought I was. And we sometimes find ourselves in a different environment that can also impact our imposter chatter. So parenting styles, hyper supportive or hypercritical, neither particularly useful. Societal messages, organizational messages, and university culture messages, absolutely part of it. And there's been some comments into the chat. Thank you so much for this, because this piece of where you are looking at others, if you are in a different role and you don't have that role of being a researcher or professor, you feel inferior. I'm not as good as. Or if you're working for Oxford University but you didn't go to Oxford, you know, maybe that's part of it. You're on a fixed term, not a permanent contract. Yes, that's in there as well. Or doing work that's normally done by an academic, but you only work, lovely this, you only work in a library. So can't possibly be as good, because it's the I'm just a going through in the mindset. And what we're doing there is comparing ourselves to others, but the organizational culture almost forces that to happen because it's a constant in your face drip feed. Yeah, absolutely. And then there's something about feeling other for different reasons. Now, it can be cultural, it can be from an ethnicity, diversity, gendered, neurodiversity, disability background, all of that. But there's one lady came up to me in London after a session. She said, "Oh, that was so me, Kate. I was brought up in a council house in the north of England." So for her, it's got nothing to do with the normal, as we'd see from an EDI perspective on the protected characteristics. It was simply she had a council house northern upbringing and therefore didn't belong working in the City of London. And for some students that go to Oxford University or indeed Cambridge, which is where I used to live in Cambridge, dare I say the other one? It's like, oops, is that perhaps a little swear word in amongst Oxford? But it's the other one, and when you have that, oh, I'm the first one to go to either an Oxbridge or a Russell group, or I'm the first one in my family to get to university. Now, how did I belong? How did I get here? Should I be here? There's some of that that's going through too, that we think about and feel other, particularly if we don't have role models. And one of the things that's so great about these sorts of sessions, and when we get to it, we get the opportunity to give you conversations in smaller groups, and you can find there are other people like you. The role models that you have that are, yes, although I've done this, this was my background, and we tend to see the successful part, but not the how did I get here part. So my encouragement would be for you to look at the different facets of yourself and think about, and perhaps even choose to challenge who you see yourself as being. Because that's one of the ways to think about managing the imposter feelings. Now, there are a few more that I'd like to go through. And one of the others that we can give you the opportunity to do is to start to talk about the mask. And if you just bear with me a tick, I will go and reach for my mask, because we think sometimes what the outside world is seeing is a mask. And if only we took our mask away, they'd see the real flawed you. Whereas in actual fact, this bit, the mask, is the real bit. And if we spoke about the mask to somebody who would listen to us, who would help us explore our own internal thinking, we can then perhaps start to recognize that we're not weird. It's not strange. It's a fairly normal occurrence, but it's not a helpful occurrence. So then speaking about it and just purely acknowledging it, according to academic research, means that it lessens the imposter chatter. What you're doing is you are then no longer holding on to a secret. Then perhaps you would like to challenge your self-talk. Challenge the way in which you talk to yourself in your heads, or maybe talk out loud. Because what we're doing here, sometimes we dismiss our successes to luck. Oh, I just happened to get lucky. They were just being kind. I've had people tell me that they've got a job because the interviewers liked them. Or when I got my first result from my academic essay and got a distinction, it was obvious that the University of East London had made a mistake, wasn't it? Now, that can't be right. You can't get a distinction for your first ever academic essay. I didn't dare ask them to remark it, but sometimes we think, oh, they've let me into Oxford by mistake. That sometimes the admissions department made a mistake in allowing me through the system. That will be some students' thinking. It's faulty thinking. It's not actually helpful thinking, but it does trigger also the imposter chatter. And then we put our success sometimes down to hard work, or I'm just doing my job, as was mentioned earlier about the library. So it's the I'm just a ... No, take the word just out. I am. Own it with strength rather than diminish it with the word just. Oh, if I can do it, anyone can do it. And I had one lady tell me, well, if I can get into Oxford, then anyone can get into Oxford. That is not true. If she could get into Oxford, others could get into Oxford, but not anyone. And in actual fact, she is the one who has. So it's a different perspective. And if we look at a recipe for success, I would argue that luck and hard work have a role to play in creating success. But there are three things that also are needed in big dollops, and that is knowledge, skills, and abilities. Please do not forget those. So a little bit of success, a little bit of hard work, absolutely, but that is not the whole story. So now something really practical that you can choose to do, not just about your thinking and challenging that, not just about talking to other people and opening up about the conversations, but what about collecting the evidence from the outside perspective? And this is the one that made the biggest change to me. And I'll explain what I mean and tell you why. So if you'd like to do another quick run into the chat, when we think about feedback that you get, we remember the negative feedback. We remember the improvement points that we're given. They are seared into our brains, and sometimes they are also stored somewhere and in a drive that means to say, right, when I come to my appraisal, I've got to prove that I've evidenced and overcome that piece of negative feedback and I've developed along the way. But what about the positive feedback that you get? So the question that I'd like you to answer now into the chat with a Y or an N, so Y for yes, N for no, is do you already keep your positive feedback? So Y for yes, N for no. And there's a question popped into the chat there about, well, what if nobody notices? Sometimes we don't get the positive feedback that we need, and it is okay, strangely enough, it is okay to ask for it. So there's a I love that. I've just seen a comment. Yes, but it took me till I was 46 to do it. And sometimes it is an interesting point, isn't it? It's like, oh, I daren't keep it, it's not good enough, or I know I should, but I'm not doing it yet. So interesting. Another one person's put in there, yes, but not as loudly as the negative. It is interesting, isn't it? And you do so also, somebody else, as a good reminder that I do get positive feedback. And this question that went into the chat just before the answers started to come through about what if nobody notices, is that there are chances that people will notice, but you might not be noticing the feedback that you're getting. And quite often with the imposter chatter, we dismiss quite easily. And I'll put three things into the chat, which is an easy thing to do. We either automatically delete it, or we distort it and say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? They'd say it to everybody. Generalize. So we delete, we distort, or we generalize what's been going on, the feedback. So sometimes we don't notice ourselves getting positive feedback, but equally it is okay to ask for it. And so yes, but it's been popped into the chat now about somebody's flatmate had a brilliant idea of asking to explicitly state what was good in their work. Thank you for sharing that, because that is exactly the next point. When you get positive feedback that goes, that was great, it's not helpful. What specifically was great about it so I can do it next time is a really good question to ask. To help me understand what you want from that, or what you found particularly good, could you be specific on what you found useful so I can replicate it? Now, ask for the feedback in that way, not a way of, oh, I'm desperate for positive feedback, please feed me. It's to help me understand whether I'm doing a good job. Could you tell me what I'm working at that particularly is good from your perspective? So keeping the positive feedback. And I love the fact we've got an idea of it being called a golden file. I've had smile files suggested before. I've had wonderful me files suggested before. Mine is simply called feedback. But please now, for those of you who have put a no into the chat, there were a few yeses, but the majorities were no's. For those of you who put a no into the chat, in your start box, would you like to set up your golden file? Is that an email folder that you will be creating now to store the positive feedback in? Is it one on your phone that you maybe keep as a favourites, an asterisk, and you photograph the emails and snapshot and store them somewhere so you can review them later? So this is a 3-step process. The first step is to keep the positive feedback. The best type of feedback to keep is the specific positive feedback. But I would suggest right at the outset, start to keep all of it. Good job, thanks very much. Keep all of it. It doesn't really matter at the very beginning. Then review it. Because to counteract the imposter chatter, to counteract the negative that is there, and one piece of research by Roy Baumeister was entitled "Bad is Stronger Than Good," published in the year 2000, one of the most cited papers in positive psychology field. I think the title says it all. We remember the negatives, but we need to make extra effort to remember the positives. So keep your feedback and review the feedback regularly. Some people will have already been keeping it and perhaps reviewing it for an annual appraisal, or perhaps reviewing it to give yourself a confidence boost when maybe you're going for an interview or a difficult task is coming up, just to give yourself a reminder and a boost. That is good, but that will not help you overcome your internal imposter chatter, because the internal imposter chatter is this sometimes low level, sometimes loud. It's this chatter that goes on in the background, and we need to keep combating it with a constant review of, okay, this is what other people say about me. This is what the external evidence says I can do. And then when you review it, the third step, if I might ask you to do three things here, is to yes and the feedback, not yes, but it. Because we can go, yes, but they would say that. Yes, but they're my manager. What do they know? Yes, but it's just the da 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 da. Yes, but it wasn't me. It was the team. We yes, but it really easily. Stop doing that. And my suggestion is to start to and the feedback. In your head, yes, and I learnt this from that situation. Yes, and I can see my skills developing in that situation. Yes, and I can see this as being a strength of mine because it's cropping up regularly. So my suggestion is that you start to yes and your feedback. And I said that this was one of my biggest aha moments, because what I've been doing for a number of years now is keeping feedback from clients. And I stick them onto my proposals when I send off a proposal for a piece of work to a new client, and I choose the different bits of feedback. And then at one point I went, do you know what? Other people are saying all of this about me, and I'm still not really believing it. That's arrogant, isn't it? If I believe myself over and above the external evidence, and I don't want to be arrogant, so maybe I should let some of that on the inside. So just a bit of thought for you, thinking about the perspective, who's right? You know yourself subjectively, other people know you objectively. Which could be a clearer view of yourself? I might suggest the objective evidence. Now, when you are giving feedback to others, there is a key point that I would like to mention, is not to tell them how amazing they are. There's research that indicates get my words right, overinflated praise increases the imposter chatter. That's an amazing job. You'll be fantastic. I've got every faith in you. You'll be brilliant. No problem whatsoever. And the imposter chatter goes through the roof. Being specific in your praise, because I know you've done da 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 da, or because I see this da 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 in you, I know you will be okay. I know you will be able to do that job. So you're very specific in the feedback that you give to others. And a hunch that I have that's not actually evidenced in research yet is that if we use the word strengths in the feedback that we give to others, I think it might bypass the imposter filter. So in other words, if you tell people in the feedback, this was a good job because, or even preferably because da 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 da, it was a good job. And I see X as a strength of yours. So whether that's attention to detail, whether it's the ability to analyze data, whatever it might have to be, produce a report that's nice and clear and understandable, to summarize things in a particular way. If you can tell people what you see as their strength, by using the word strength into the feedback, it ensures that you are specific, and it also, I think, stops that brain challenge coming through. Yeah, great comment here into the chat as well, as being helpful to realize that your brain is not always your ally, and you need to challenge it like an unreliable narrator. That's some lovely words. Thank you for that. What you'll find on the webpage, for those of you who've joined since I started, that is kateatkin.com/MPLS, which you might like Joe to pop it into the chat so people can access the link as they've joined a little later. You'll find on that webpage there are some links to some strength profiles, because knowing and understanding your strengths, you can do it by collecting your feedback and analysing it. You can do it by also taking a strengths profile. Choosing to do that is one of the other options, and knowing and using your strengths in the workplace, understanding them when you're studying, knowing what you're good at, recognizing that and acknowledging what you don't or can't do yet is really helpful to help combat the imposter chatter. As is finding a mentor. The mentor can help you overcome by giving you some external perspectives. So I know some of you right at the start were talking about helping and supporting students in programs. Fantastic. If you've got a mentoring program going, whether that's a buddy perspective or not, is really good. So the website's gone into the chat now. Take a look and you can find that there. Having a mentor can be really, really helpful. Formal or informal, it doesn't really matter, but somebody that can give you that external perspective can be really helpful. And then 2 words to touch on before I come to a close as we get close to that 1 o'clock. And the first word is this desire for perfection. We, with the imposter chatter, want to be perfect. We want to get it right, not just first time, but every time, preferably. And I have a little bit of news for you. You are not perfect. You are human. So what we really need to aim for is something called optimal functioning, which maybe is where we put the 80% rule into play, where we work to 80% of our abilities, which is 100% of the Just Good Enough Club's ability, and we don't overwork ourselves. We don't overstress ourselves. And the second academic essay, I quoted loads. I read lots of research papers, quoted lots. I hadn't stayed focused enough. And so in my brain, it was only a merit. I mean, a merit is good enough. A merit is more than good enough, because a pass would have been good enough. So sometimes we need to pull back and look at our optimal functioning rather than perfection. And I'd also suggest we might like to reframe the F word. And the F word is, of course, that one of failure. To think about, well, with the imposter chatter, we're going, oh, it didn't work. I failed. I am a failure. When I did my research for my MSc with the 12 entrepreneurs, 10 of them gave me some really interesting insight into their perspective about failures, but they did not report high on the Clance imposter phenomenon scale. The 2 that reported high on the Clance imposter phenomenon scale went, gosh, if the team fails, it's down to me. You know, every failure, I take it on board. It's the worst thing out. But the other 10 simply said this: there were a number of things that didn't work. So I learned from it, and I moved on. Failure was not detrimental. Now, logically, I have known that, but it's not something that you tend to logically know in yourself, but hearing other people say was really, really helpful. So that was the Clance imposter phenomenon scale that I mentioned, which Pauline Clance put together. It's used for research purposes. So it's something that I've used with my research participants, both for my MSc dissertation and also for my PhD. So that's, you can take a look, but it's one that's out there for research purposes. Now, the final piece for you to think about as we get towards this 1 o'clock mark is for you to now reflect for yourselves on your stop, start, think about and carry on messages. What are you going to take away from this? And then we will stop the recording and we will give you the opportunity in a moment to go into some breakout rooms. But just before we stop the recording, may I also mention one thing that's come through from Brené Brown, because I think sometimes we can choose courage or we can choose comfort, and we can't choose both. And I think to accept how good you are, to understand your knowledge, your skills and your abilities takes some courage. It's not easy, it can be uncomfortable, but it can be really useful to do. So there's the web page again. Thank you so much for being with me. For those of you who need to go, whether it's to another meeting, whether it's to go and grab a bite to eat, then feel free to tootle off. Joe, feel free to stop the recording. And